The iron hit with the sound of metal on stone, and then the whole blast hole came alive. Phineas Gage was standing over a cut in the rock near Cavendish, Vermont, on the afternoon of September 13th, 1848, doing the kind of railroad work he had done many times before. He was 25 years old, a foreman on the Rutland and Burlington Railroad, and by all accounts, he was good at the job. The crew had drilled a hole, packed it with powder and fuse, and the next step was simple in theory. Add sand over the powder, then tamp it down with an iron bar so the force of the blast would drive into the rock instead of out into the air. Something went wrong in that sequence. The sand was likely missing or incomplete. When Gage's tamping iron struck the rock, the powder ignited. The iron became a missile. It entered the left side of his face, passed behind his left eye, tore upward through the front part of his brain, and exited through the top of his skull before landing some distance away, blood and brain tissue on the metal. Men who saw it expected him to die where he stood. Instead, he gave a few convulsive movements, then began to speak. The tamping iron was no small tool. Contemporary descriptions and later museum records place it at a little over 3.5 feet long, about 1.25 inches thick at the wider end, and more than 13 pounds. A bar like that should have killed him instantly. Yet within minutes, Gage was conscious enough to talk, and soon after that he was able to ride in an ox cart into town. One of the first doctors to see him, Edward Williams, later reported that Gage greeted him in a way that sounded almost impossible under the circumstances. Gage was upright, speaking, and aware that something catastrophic had happened to his head. The front of his skull had been blown open, his left eye was damaged beyond saving, and brain matter was visible in the wound. But he was alive, alert, and still answering questions. Dr. John Martin Harlow took charge of the case that evening. He cleaned the wound, removed loose bone fragments, and tried to manage an injury that 19th century medicine was almost never equipped to save. The first days were bad. Gage bled heavily, he vomited. Infection set in. At one point his condition deteriorated so badly that the people around him thought the end was near. Harlow later described periods of delirium and deep weakness. For days the case looked less like a miracle than a delay. But Gage did not die. By early October he was sitting up, then walking. Before long he could recognize people, speak clearly, and move around without the kind of paralysis many would expect from such an injury. The visible damage was horrifying, but the survival was undeniable. He had lost an eye and part of the front of his brain, yet he was still there in body and voice. That was the first part of the case that made Phineas Gage famous. The second part was what people said happened after he lived. Before the accident, Harlow described him as efficient, capable, and balanced enough to be trusted with railroad blasting work and a crew of men. After the accident, Harlow later wrote that Gage was fitful, impatient, rude at times, and less able to stick to plans. That is where the phrase, "no longer Gage," entered the story. Over time, the case became one of the most repeated examples in medicine and psychology, often reduced to a single lesson that damage to the frontal lobes can alter personality and judgment. But the historical record is thinner and more complicated than the legend. Some behavioral changes were reported by people who knew him, especially Harlow. At the same time, later scholarship has pushed back against the cartoon version of Gage as a man permanently transformed into a monster overnight. What can be said with confidence is that a severe brain injury was followed by changes serious enough to affect his work and reputation, but not so absolute that he became incapable of functioning for the rest of his life. That mattered because Gage's life did not end in the railroad cut. He recovered enough to travel. He was exhibited for a time in New England and New York, as men with unusual injuries often were in that era, partly because the case drew paying crowds, and partly because doctors wanted to see with their own eyes what should not have been survivable. In 1850, he was examined in Boston by Henry Jacob Bigelow, who helped spread the case to a wider medical audience. Later, Gage moved west and eventually went to Chile, where he worked as a stagecoach driver. That detail is important because it cuts through the simplest myth. Driving a coach over long routes, handling horses, dealing with passengers, and managing a demanding schedule required more consistency and practical control than the standard legend allows. Modern historians and neurologists point to that period as evidence that whatever changes followed the injury, Gage also regained substantial function. He was not frozen forever in the worst stage of his recovery. Even so, the damage stayed with him. In early 1860, after returning to California to live with family, Gage began having repeated seizures. They worsened over time. On May 21st, 1860, almost 12 years after the accident, he died in San Francisco at the age of 36. The tamping iron outlived him. So did the questions raised by his case. Years later, Harlow obtained Gage's skull and the iron from the family, and both were eventually placed in the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard. They remain among the most famous objects in medical history because they force the story into physical form. The skull still shows the path. The iron still looks like something a man might have held in both hands on an ordinary workday, not the instrument of one of the strangest survivals ever documented. What made the survival so frightening was not only the violence of the injury, but the number of moments in which he should have died afterward, and did not. He should have died in the blast. He should have died on the cart ride into town. He should have died in the infected days that followed, when fever and swelling nearly took him. Instead, he stayed conscious, then ambulatory, then functional enough to live another dozen years. The case became a landmark, not because it was clean or simple, but because it was not. It showed that a man could suffer devastating injury to the frontal part of the brain and still remain recognizably himself in some ways, altered in others, and medically baffling in almost every respect. That tension is why the story endured. It was never just about gore, though the wound was ghastly enough. It was about survival crossing into uncertainty. The man lived. The old life did not fully come back. Something changed, something remained, and medicine had to confront both facts at once. In the years since, Phineas Gage has been turned into symbol, cautionary tale, neuroscience landmark, and popular legend. But stripped back to the ground where it happened, the story was more immediate than any later interpretation. A railroad foreman leaned over a blast hole. An iron rod exploded through his skull. He rose, spoke, traveled to a doctor, lived through infection, and walked back into the world carrying one of the most devastating head injuries ever survived. For people around him, that was not theory. It was a man whose face had been torn open and who kept breathing anyway. For the doctors who treated him, it was a case that would follow medicine for generations. And for Gage himself, it was 12 extra years wrestled out of a moment that should have killed him where he stood. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.